afternoon, everyone. Oh, come on. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our 2010 Legislative Conference. My name is John Bohm. I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Relations, Public Affairs, Field Operations for NARA. I'm thrilled so many of you are here and joining us for what I think is going to be a stimulating and thought-provoking discussion on the federal budget. I also want to welcome our visitors and viewers from around the country. I'm so pleased to announce that this presentation is being webcast on the Concord Coalition website and on the NARA website for those around the country who couldn't be here with us. So welcome to all of you around the country. Those of you who know me and know this, my involvement in this program know that this is perhaps one of my favorite portions of the program. It's one we've worked very hard to develop over the years. It's designed principally to encourage a broader perspective and a broader understanding of the pressures and the situations involving the larger federal budget, and to encourage thinking on those larger issues in the context of what we do and the context of our own immediate interests and concerns with respect to the budget, largely in the area of discretionary spending for programs like CDBG, Section 8, and public housing. Now, our panelists are not expert on those program issues or program spending issues, but I will tell you this panel are our nation's leading experts on the federal budget. And for that and for their kindness, for their willingness to be here on a Sunday, and for their involvement in this panel, I sincerely thank you. I also want to just a point of privilege here, want to particularly note our ongoing relationship with and the involvement of the Concord Coalition in this portion of our program. Each year we invite the best and the brightest to participate in this portion of the program. And if I do say so myself, it's one of the better programs on the federal budget in town. But each year, and since my involvement, we've had a representative from the Concord Coalition on the panel. And that representative is Bob Bixby, their director. And I want to thank Bob and the staff here who are helping us with the webcast today for their involvement in particular. It's part of a larger effort on the part of NARA to build relationships with other organizations of like mind and like concerns in this town. So Bob, thank you for all that you've done for working with us. Without further ado, and speaking of relationships, a couple of years ago, we had the wisdom and the good fortune to build a relationship with Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know a leading writer, editor for Congressional Quarterly, Chuck Conlon. My NARA colleagues know that each morning your day begins with a reading of CQ's budget tracker. That's a daily publication put out by Congressional Quarterly online that gives you an understanding of what's happening with the federal budget and the appropriations process. Required reading for those of us that are involved in the appropriations work and an understanding of the budget. And I'm thrilled that once again we're joined by the editor of CQ Budget Tracker, Chuck Conlon, who will serve today as your moderator. So without further ado, please welcome my friend and my colleague, Chuck Conlon.
John, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Washington, D.C. again. My name is Chuck Conlon. I'm with CQ Budget Tracker. And you've come back to D.C. at a time of great uncertainty in the budget. The economy is struggling to recover from a financial crisis and a deep economic recession that was on the cusp of being possibly a depression. And those events and the government responses to them have contributed to budget deficits like we've never seen before, well above $1 trillion last year, this year, next year. President Obama's budget projects 10-year deficits averaging just under $1 trillion. I think it never gets under $700 billion. And the situation is just going to get worse as baby boomers retire and more people join Social Security and Medicare. With the deficits and the accumulated debt that's growing, the American public is finally starting to pay attention. They're not happy. It's re-energized Republican calls for cutting federal spending. And Democrats as well are also embracing fiscal discipline. President Obama in his budget has proposed a 3-year freeze on discretionary spending. He's created a commission now to look at long-term spending entitlements, try to find ways of reducing the spending there, possibly bringing in more revenues. It's a bipartisan commission, but unfortunately, it's hard to find bipartisanship in this town right now. Especially now. I think we've got the nadir of things as vitriolic as the debate has been on health care. And of course, coming this fall, we have elections. At this point, a lot of analysts are saying that both chambers of Congress could be up for grabs. So I don't know that we're going to see that much in the way of bipartisan cooperation. But to talk about all the budget situations, the fiscal situation, we have a great panel here today. Bob Bixby, sitting closest to me here, is the executive director of the nonpartisan Concord Coalition, which for years have been pressing Congress to be more fiscally responsible. In recent years, the organization has also been part of the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. It's a broad spectrum of groups, conservative, liberal, that have crisscrossed the nation trying to raise awareness of the fiscal situation facing our nation. Donald Marin, sitting in the center, currently a visiting professor at Georgetown, but he served in numerous key governmental economic positions. He's been the head of the Congressional Budget Office, executive director of Congress's Joint Economic Committee, and a member of President Bush's Council on Economic Advisors. John Irons at the end, like Donald Marin, is also a PhD economist with a long history of public policy work. John currently focuses on budget and tax policy at the Economic Policy Institute, and he previously worked at the Liberal Center for Economic Progress, the Brookings Institution, and as well as the Federal Reserve Board. Each of our panelists today is going to give a brief presentation on the situation, try to set the stage for further discussions and for your questions, which we'll get to shortly. So with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Bob Bixby with the Concord Coalition.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you once again to depress you on a Sunday afternoon. A few years ago, I would come to these things and say, I know the fiscal situation is improving, but I'm telling you, there are these long-term problems, and it was difficult to get people to believe that there might be some problems, and then I worried about coming across sounding hysterical or something, that you're trying to make a problem, and then all of a sudden you go from a deficit of 162 billion, and 2 years later you're at a deficit of 1.4 trillion, and it's just like, whoa, where did that come from? It's actually a combination of factors, actually. And what I'm going to do is just look at some budget dynamics on the long term that I think are important to set up a discussion about why we have been doing a fiscal wake-up tour and are now doing a fiscal solutions tour on what do you do about it. Okay, well, economists like to talk about budgets as a percentage of GDP because that's a good way of just in terms of looking at the impact of the budget on our national economy and our national income. It's a better way than looking at the budget in terms of just dollar figures alone to give you some context. So what we see in a historical pattern is that the federal government has tended to spend about 21% of GDP and tax a little over 18% of GDP, meaning that we've tended to run budget deficits. I mean, ideally the two lines would be together. So we tend to run budget deficits somewhere around 2% of GDP. And if we were going to do that, that might be a little, I might be concerned about it as a deficit hawk. But we probably never would have been doing a fiscal wake-up tour because things wouldn't have been that catastrophic looking over. You might be able to carry a budget deficit that size. The problem here that we've got is you can see things literally going off the charts in the last year or two. But then it's that projected period. You never get back to a sustainable size deficit. And that's really the problem here is that we don't have a cyclical problem. I mean, we do have a cyclical problem. That's driving a lot of the short-term budget deficit. And war is another factor because that is a traditional cause of deficits in our nation's history, wars and recession. We got that going for us right now. The problem is when the economy recovers and the effects of the war presumably have faded, we're still on a track that's unsustainable. And talk about unsustainable. This was just the short term, 20 years being short term in this case. But the really unsustainable problem is what's happening with the three largest entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And we've had a lot of talk this year about health care reform, and that's why. It's because those programs, Social Security being driven primarily by the demographics, Medicare by demographics plus rising health care costs, means that if we don't do something to control the costs of those programs, which are very popular, very important programs, the resulting deficits would be so large you can see what actually happens to interest costs. Interest costs are eventually what kill you because the government is borrowing all that money to run deficits. It adds to the interest costs, that adds to the deficit, and so the needs for short-term fiscal restraint once we get the economy back under control is because we have this long-term structural deficit. And of course, what would happen to debt held by the public as a percentage of the economy? Well, it's on a truly unsustainable track. We've usually in the post-World War II phase headed somewhere around in the 30 or 40% of our economy. It's up to it'll be around 64% this year. And then if we don't take some very serious measures to get things back under control, it'll be going through the roof shortly thereafter. So let me just leave you with one little factoid before turning things over to Don. When I look at the short-term picture, this one here, I mean, one of the problems is interest costs, and I maybe we can get back to that in the Q&A. But it's interest costs now are fairly small as a percentage of the budget. It's a couple $100 billion. That's a lot of money, about the same as we're spending on the wars. But you go out 10 years running these enormous budget deficits, and the interest costs really begin to explode, so that by the end of even 10 years, I'm not talking about 20, 30 years down the road, interest costs would be more than we spend on all of national defense, around $800 billion. Or you could take all the rest of the federal government agencies, lump them all together, and it would be more than that. So we really do have a problem. We have a long-term problem. We have a short-term problem. And as for what we might do about them, then hopefully we'll be able to talk about that some in the Q&A. I'm not an economist, but the next fellow is, and I can just show you numbers, and he can tell you why. John?
Cool, thanks. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm afraid, our job is to be the three amigos being depressing on a Sunday afternoon. But, you're nice to come to that show. So Bob did a good description of what the fiscal challenges are that we face. What John and Chuck asked me to talk about was a little bit about our economic situation and then what the implications of that are going to be for our budget situation. And you guys all know probably better than I do that the current state of our economy is not good. We've had some glimmers of hope recently where the economy grew at a fairly strong rate at the fourth quarter of last year. It's probably still growing at the moment. But we still have not turned into an economy that's generating jobs, although maybe on Friday we'll see our first significant positive job report in some time. Unemployment rate is still up near 10%, right? Not a happy situation out there. Eventually we will recover from that. And unfortunately, the story I want to bring to you is that even after we kind of recover from the basic cyclical downturn we've had and the unemployment rate starts coming down, there are reasons to think that going forward, the economy is not going to grow as fast as we may become accustomed to during our lifetimes, and that has obvious implications for the federal budget. Right? Because ultimately, it's the size of the overall economy that drives the government's ability to raise tax revenues to pay for the various programs that we want to undertake. And to the extent that the economy is going to grow more slowly in the future, that's going to limit basically the pool of money that's available to pay for rising Social Security expenses, rising Medicare and Medicaid expenses, and then the oft-forgotten but incredibly important expenses on everything else the federal government has. And so I just want to hit you up with basically two economic challenges in the long run, two quick charts. Okay, the first one here is one that I created using some data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Think of that as the club of developed economies. Right? So if you're an aspiring economy, you want to be a member of the OECD. And what the OECD did was they went back and they looked at it and they said, they tried to look at the performance of major economies in the past when there have been major economic shocks and major financial crises. And basically asked the question, okay, to what extent do those economies turn out to be permanently smaller relative to what was previously their trajectory than what people had expected and reasonably anticipated going into the crisis? Right, so to what extent do you get basically persistent loss in the size of the economy? And these are their projections for all the OECD members of how much smaller, in essence, economies will be even after they recover from kind of the cyclical component of the downturn. Right, they're going to have higher capital costs. They're going to have smaller labor forces going forward. How big is that effect? And so the unfortunate story is the blue bar on the far right from your point of view, which is that according to the OECD, the U.S. economy was going to be persistently lower by about 2.5%. Even after we kind of recover from the sharp downturn, right after we get back on a reasonable growth trajectory, than we were reasonably going to expect before the crisis. Right? They're going to be long-term pain and suffering. Right? For example, we're going to have a smaller capital stock because the cost of capital will be higher. We'll have somewhat lower labor force just because of the crisis. Now, that's bad news, right? That means the pie is smaller. There's going to be less revenue to go around. The good news is you'll notice that we are way over to the right, and that relative to other nations, we seem to be doing better. And the reason for this is that relative to other developed economies, we actually have a quite flexible, resilient economy that does a good job of responding to crises, right, to economic shocks. If you would ask me in 2006 what was going to be the story of the U.S. economy at the beginning of the century, right, the answer was going to be that it was a resilient economy, that bad things kept happening to and it kept growing. Right? And so obviously, right, that story doesn't play quite as well given the severity of the crisis we've had, but there's still an underlying truth. We have a flexible economy. We do a relatively good job of reallocating capital and labor, and certainly a much better job of that than many other developed economies. Right, so that's the glimmer of good news, is that we're far off to the right. Another sliver of bad news here, though, is that notice that many of our major trading partners are also going to have significant ongoing pain and suffering in the aftermath of the economic crisis. And that therefore kind of the boost to the economy we can get from export growth is going to be correspondingly limited. Separate from the research that went into this chart, there's also just a variety of historical studies that have been done by the IMF by some folks named Ken Rogarth and Carmen Reinhardt, who have a book out called This Time is Different, and various other organizations that have looked at financial crises in the past. And the universal takeaway is just that it takes a long time to heal from financial crises. You don't bounce back instantly, and there are persistent effects. Okay, so gloomy economic challenge number one is that this is going to be with us for a while, and it's going to moderate economic growth, and therefore moderate what we can expect on the revenue side. Okay. Gloomy issue number two has to do with the demographic change of our economy, and particularly of our labor force. What this is a chart of is this shows what's called labor force participation rates, which is basically, to oversimplify slightly, right, take all the people who you might think of as being potentially in the labor force, which is roughly people from, roughly age 21 to 65, plus a few others. And then ask what fraction of them are actually out there trying to get a job or actually out there having a job. And what you have is what happened to labor force participation from 1950, and then a projection through 2020. It was prepared by the Congressional Budget Office. They have to project this in order to make their budget forecast. And the story you'll see here is that for much of our adult lives, right, an expanding labor force participation rate was a helpful tailwind for the overall economy. Right, that we saw, for example, the primary driver of this was that an increasing number of women entered the labor force, got jobs, that boosted the size of the economy. We also saw some growth among older folks in participating. And then as you go from kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s, you have a period where that's helping expand the economy, contribute to economic growth, and then again, right, create a larger pie that the government can then rely upon for tax revenue. When you look at what happened in the last decade, right, we look back on the 2000s and we say this was not a period of strong job growth in the U.S. One reason for that is that labor force participation started flattening out and actually going down. And then if you look out over the next decade, right, even after we kind of recover from the current economic crisis, that's why there are two lines there. There's kind of the potential and then what's happening because there's a sharp downturn. And even after we recover from that, the CBO expects that labor force participation is going to continue to go down, basically because changing demographics. Right? As the population ages, the budget story is not just that there's going to be more spending on Social Security, more spending on Medicare, more spending on Medicaid. Right? Another story is that the labor force is going to grow more slowly because people who are, say, age 60 are less likely to have a job than people who are, say, age 45. And so again, this is a story about how we should expect, we basically should have more humble expectations for the economy going into the next decade. That the growth rates we've been accustomed to in the past aren't likely to replicate what they've been in the past. And then we're going to have to make our budget decisions recognizing that basically we're not going to have these tailwinds in the past that have provided more revenue for the government. Now, I hope I'm wrong on that, right? So I hope that, sort of there's miraculous economic growth and all sorts of extra revenue that we can use to deal with our budget challenges. But unfortunately, my takeaway is that we need to be humble and have sort of moderate expectations for what our economy can actually achieve. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to John, who will have yet another set of grim things to say. Maybe not.
Okay, thanks. Here's my lightning title, a couple random slides about the budget. When we were discussing this event, John suggested we limit our presentation to no more than 2 slides. And to economists, it's kind of like asking a dentist, you can pull no more than 2 teeth. It's good news for the patient, but the dentist comes out somewhat less than satisfied. So I actually have 4 slides. I'm only going to show you 2. Maybe we'll come back to 2 later on. But I basically have two points I want to address. One point is to quickly look at more the short-term picture. We've talked a little bit about the long-term, looking at 20 years, 50 years. I want to look a little bit at where we've been, a little bit where we're going, and to focus a little bit less on the entitlement picture that we saw earlier, a little more on domestic discretionary spending, which in many ways is a little more relevant to the issues that you are here to talk about. So first slide is to do kind of a mental experiment. Let's go back to 2007 and look at what the deficit was projected to be, and then look at what it is today and see what caused the increase in the deficit. And the answer is overwhelmingly the economy. So what this graph shows is percentage of the increase in the deficit since 2007, before there was a recession, and breaks it down by various components. More than half of the deficit, or the increase in the deficit, is due to what are called economic or technical factors. This is the economy going into the tank. Okay, the economic slowdown means fewer revenues, higher spending automatically, and as a result, you have a much larger deficit. Some of the costs for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and bailout are in that category as well. The second big piece there is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus package that was passed about this time last year. That added a little bit more to the deficit, not as much as the economy going into the tank, but it was an additional piece as well, about 12.5% of the increase in the deficit. The TARP program, this is the bailout of Wall Street, costs an additional approximately 10%. So if you look at these three big economic factors, the recession itself and the two major responses to the recession, together those three factors accounted for about 75% of the increase in the deficit since 2007. The war is another component, and then there are some changes to tax policy and some changes to spending that added up the remaining quarter of the increase in deficit. So again, the overwhelming story in the short run was this is an economic force that caused the increase in deficit to move from the $182 billion to the $1.4 trillion we have today. So let me look at the trend in discretionary spending. This is a chart going back to 1970 to forecast out over the next 5 years. It runs out to 2016, I believe. And it looks at non-security discretionary spending. So it does not include Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It does include most of the rest of what's in the budget. It excludes security spending. So the Department of Defense is not in here, the war is not in here, Department of Homeland Security is not in here. So these are a lot of the core programs people think about when they think about a lot of the programs similar to what you're interested in. If you look at the 30-year trend, going back to 1975 roughly, you see that as a share of the economy, these numbers are represented as a share of GDP. Discretionary, non-security discretionary spending has actually shrunk considerably, going from around 6% of GDP back in 1975 to projected to be about 3% next year, and scheduled to go down a little bit farther in the next 5 years as well. Part of the reason for the decline in the next 5 years is because of Obama's budget freeze on non-security defense spending. If you freeze the nominal budget and the economy is growing, you see as a share of the economy, the amount of spending is going to go down slightly. This assumes, of course, that the numbers in President Obama's budget go through. Whether or not that happens, of course, is an open question. You'll notice a spike in 2009. That spike is the Recovery Act. So as a result of the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, you see that there was an increase in the amount of spending, and that largely went through discretionary programs. So you saw this one-time spike, and we're set to kind of decrease to more normal levels over the next 5 years or so. So those are the basic numbers. If we want to, in the Q&A, get into more detail on the impact of the freeze, we're welcome to do so. But this is the basic story. I guess there's two main points. One point is it's the economy stupid. Right? That's the main cause of the deficit we have today, the deficit we will have for the next 5 years or so. Yes, there is indeed a long-term problem, but that is a long-term problem and not in the next 5 years. The second point to make here is that when you just look at this chart, the rhetoric you oftentimes hear about federal government spending being out of control, if you look purely at the discretionary side, that is absolutely not the case. You've seen over 30 years a cut almost in half of the domestic discretionary budget. So the idea that spending is out of control is simply not true. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. I guess I want to start out questioning with, have to consider the elephant in the room, the congressional enactment now, the signing of the health care legislation. Specifically, what budgetary impact is going to be of this. CBO says it's going to reduce deficits in the future. Republicans challenge that assumption. Then, in the long term, what impact will it have on reducing the so-called the cost curve in the growth of Medicare or Medicaid spending, just healthcare spending in general? I know from a fiscal perspective, that's always been one of the key aspects of it. So if you could just address those, and then the economy in general, is it going to have a beneficial impact, neutral impact, or negative impact?
Nothing like starting with an easy question. And How much time do you have? Well, I suppose we all want to weigh in on that. I think that from a fiscal point of view, a couple of things that I worry about. The first is that I take the CBO's word for it. I don't question the CBO's analysis that if everything happens as written in the law, the CBO has done its best to take there's so many provisions, and it's very difficult to know how any of this is going to play out. So nobody really knows, because there's a lot of interacting parts here. It's not it's a pretty ambitious bill. So, I mean, bottom line is nobody really knows. But the good thing is that the Congress did make a pledge to have a bill that would not increase the deficit, unlike, say, the Medicare prescription drug bill from a few years ago, which nobody even attempted to pay for. So you start out in a more fiscally responsible vein right there. And then also, they made a commitment to make sure that the bill would be going in the right direction at the end of 10 years. I mean, it's one thing to say that it's going to be deficit neutral over 10 years, and then the heck with what happens after that. In this one, they made a deliberate attempt to come up with a score which would be showing rising savings over time, which I think is very important. So that's also the good. Then you get into the question of, is it really going to happen? And there are two things that I worry about. One is that there are some very ambitious assumptions for controlling costs in Medicare, for one thing, and for tax increases that are going to come in 2018 and beyond. That's the so-called Cadillac tax that everybody's heard about, on the tax on high-cost plans. A lot of folks feel that that's an important cost control mechanism, as well as revenue raiser, and so it's an important part of the bill, and it survived, and I'm very glad it survived. But, if for a controversial provision to be its effect to take place so far in the future, we're going to have 2 presidential elections and several congressional elections before that, so it's just sort of hanging out there as being a vulnerable thing that could be altered. So there are a number of things that I think it'll be important for those of us worried about the budget to be vigilant about. I think it's very good that there's a commission called an IPAB, Independent Payment Advisory Board, which stuck in the bill so far, which is going to be a constant source of recommendations that Congress will have to accept. Well, they can reject them, but I mean, they'll go into effect. So, there are cost controls in the bill, but there are reasons to be cautious. And my final point is, and this is the most important point from a fiscal point of view as far as I'm concerned, if it all works as planned, and we do get the deficit reduction that's projected, those charts that I showed you would not change much. Because we're on an unsustainable track, and this would say, okay, we're going to find a way to include most Americans in health care, but we're still going to be, and that's a good thing, and we're going to try to pay for that, and that's a good thing, but we're still on an unsustainable track, and we've used a lot of tax increases and spending cuts that could otherwise have been used to address the fiscal problem that we already have to pay for something new. So for those people that are looking for solutions to the long-term problem, it makes it more difficult from that point of view.
So just picking up on some of Bob's thoughts. So first I want to quickly endorse the statement that ultimately no one really knows. There's a great deal of uncertainty. I have enormous respect for the Congressional Budget Office. I think they do a yeoman's job of trying to make a best estimate that the Congress can use in making these judgments. But the path of healthcare policies, the path of the structure of the healthcare system, the healthcare financing system, the growth of healthcare costs, all of those things, so there's a lot of uncertainty about them. And in coming years, at one time there was this hope that somehow there was going to be a once-and-all solution to the healthcare challenge. And that's not what's happening, right? This issue will be with us in the coming decades as we try to keep an eye on what's happening both on the health side and on the budget side. I would say in terms of my expectation of the fiscal impacts, over the next decade, I think it's really important to keep in mind that while people refer to this as a health reform bill or a health care bill, it really has a lot more in it. And so over the next 10 years, it was a healthcare reform bill, it was an education reform bill, it created some long-term care insurance, and it has a bunch of provisions that raise revenues, particularly by increasing Medicare taxes, that really don't have much to do with healthcare per se. Over the next 10 years, what happens is that healthcare spending is going to rise under the bill, but then it's going to be more than offset by savings from education, from this insurance plan that I won't talk about, and from increasing tax revenues. Then what happens in later decades, under what CBO's expectations, is that if, as Bob highlighted, if the bill executes as written, the provisions in the bill start biting more and more, and it actually is going to end up reducing federal health spending, federal commitment to healthcare. And really, the open question is, whether that's going to happen, right? There are a lot of Congresses between now and then. There are a lot of presidents between now and then. And we'll ultimately just have to keep an eye on it to see how that works out. Even if it does execute as written, though, my other concern about it from a fiscal policy point of view is, as Bob said at the end of his remarks, there's still, right, the elephant in the room, that we have this very large fiscal challenge ahead of us. And to a certain extent, to pay for this bill, we have used up some of the provisions that people like me I had earmarked in my mind as things that we would use to address our long-run budget challenge. And so my quiver of things I would tell you are the low-hanging fruits to deal with the scary stuff that Bob showed us. Right, my quiver has fewer arrows in it than it did before. And that as a result, combating the rest of our fiscal challenges will be more difficult in the future.
Well, I guess I get to be the third expert who gets to say I don't know. So, no, I don't think anyone knows what the true long-run cost is going to be, or the true savings from the healthcare bill. CBO says it saves $124 billion over the next decade, saves even more, a lot more, in the next decade. So at least according to best guesses at this point, the net effect is positive on the budget, which I think is a good thing. As was mentioned, if you look at the tax cuts that went through in 2001 and 2003, and Medicare prescription drugs, you're right, those weren't even attempted to be paid for. At least this is paid for, according to our best guesses. So that's all positive. I think in a lot of ways, because we don't know what works in terms of containing costs, containing the growth of costs, I think it's very important just to try stuff. And I think this bill does that. It tries a bunch of different things. We don't know in advance which of these provisions is going to work to control costs, but hopefully one or more of them will. And whatever works, let's build on that. So I think this is the best attempt to experiment a little bit and really try on the cost containment front to see what works. Take a best guess, try it. I think on the economic side, you also asked what the economic impact would be. Aside from the budgetary impact, aside from things that will go into an official score from the Congressional Budget Office, I think this is a net plus for the economy. I think the economy, one of the problems with our current healthcare system is we have what economists call job lock. You have people who are in a job, they have health care through their employer, and they're stuck. They have a pre-existing condition, they have a kid who has a pre-existing condition, they can't change jobs to a firm that doesn't have health insurance, they can't start their own business, they can't become self-employed. Because if you do so, would throw you at the mercy of the individual market, which is, at best, way overpriced, and at worst, you can't get covered. So I think this bill, and a lot of the regulatory provisions in it, means that from an economic perspective, you have just a huge positive when it comes to people unleashing their economic potential. And so I think that's all positive. That's not going to show up in a CBO score. That's not going to show up in anyone's official estimate of long-run economic growth. But I think there are probably real impacts there. And it's going to be very hard to figure out what those are, but it doesn't mean they're not real.
Staying on the long-term budget situation for just a moment, Don, when you spoke about how we have a more resilient economy that is able to respond to a lot of these economic shocks and such. Now, from my understanding, though, we lose a lot of that ability as we get more and more debt filled up on us, and we have more difficulty in borrowing, and if need be, having stimulus spending the way we did. I was wondering if you guys could talk about that for a moment. When does this begin to bite the continuing increase in the national debt? What are the concerns about foreign nations such as China having a substantial holding of our debt? And you're talking about possible solutions. The healthcare bill has taken off some of the ways you saw of ameliorating the problem. What do you see now as the most promising solutions in the future to address the growing fiscal balance?
On the debt, we're going to answer every question first by saying nobody really knows. There is our magic number on that. You know, we had debt up around over 100% of our economy of GDP at the end of World War II. Of course, there's a big difference between then and now. That was to fight a major war. It was not intended as a you know, permanent sort of a thing. So the fact that we did peak at that level then and the economy came out of it just fine is not a, it's a different situation now where we have a structural deficit where the debt keeps growing and growing and growing simply because of current policies, not because of some sudden emergency like a war. So right now the debt goes way up to around 60% of GDP, which is much higher than it's been at any time since the around 1950 when it was on the way back down to World War II. So now it's on the way up. And even though when the economy recovers, as Don mentioned in his remarks, we're going to see that debt as a percentage of the economy continue to escalate. And in the, you know, under the president's budget, according to the Congressional Budget Office, it would go get up to about 90% of GDP within 10 years. So you're getting back to around World War II levels to fund current policies, and that truly is unsustainable because you've got to find some way to borrow all that money and keep up the interest cost. So where we get all the money? Well, a lot of it has been coming. We've been borrowing from abroad, and you know, our debt has foreign held debt has gone from around 33% or so in the early 1990s at the end of 2000, I guess, to somewhere around 50%, a little over 50% now, and it may keep growing. So is that a bad thing? Well, it's good that other countries want to invest here. People are buying our bonds because it's considered a safe investment. But if the problem is that it does present a certain vulnerability, or you know, the decisions of other countries who may not have our best interests at heart could be affected, and also it acts as a growing national mortgage on future national income, because the benefit of that investment will go to the people that made it rather than to our economy in the future. So it's not a good thing, but there's no magic number. Some people say around 60% of GDP. That's the new magic number of we should try to keep debt as a percentage. That's the Maastricht number, I think, that they use in Europe. But I'm not going to tell you that there's anything magic about 60%. Basically, you just want to make sure you've got a policy that's sustainable.
Right, so I should note 60% is about what we're hitting today, right? And we're going up beyond it. So if that's the magic number, we're probably tomorrow going to be on one side of it. So I would say, right, so echoing right, the, you know, haha, none of us know anything. So right, there's an uncertainty about it, and so in particular for the level of debt when that comes back to bite us, it's basically when the bond market tells us that it's going to bite us. Right, you may remember, you know, James Carville's famous quote that you know, he wants to be reincarnated as the bond market because everyone lived in fear of them, which was the situation early in the Clinton administration. And we're kind of waiting for that moment, right? Interest rates have been very low for a long time. Interest rates on U.S. Treasuries went up last week, which led some people to start, you know, speculating. You know, is this the moment? Is this the moment? You know, I have no idea, but you know, I would want to see them go up a lot higher before I declare this was the moment. But you know, basically, you know, the bond market's going to decide that based on two things. It's going to decide that based on how big our debts are, and it's going to base it on whether they think we have a clue. And if we have a credible plan that says we're going to get our fiscal house in order, the bond markets are going to be more receptive to us running high levels of debt in the short run if they believe we're going to get it under control. Whereas on the other hand, if they have doubts about our long-run trajectory, they're going to come back and bite us sooner. There's been some recent research that says, you know, once you get up to 90% of GDP, you start having a significant effect on reducing growth rates. You know, that's, you know, there's some questions about how that applies to the U.S. exactly, but you know, that's kind of a place that we don't want to end up, and is what would be implied certainly by the most recent projections. You know, we'd be up in that range in 5 or 10 years. I would say, from my point of view, you know, in many ways, the most harm that comes from building up bigger debts is that it basically narrows our scope of flexibility. That to a certain extent, you know, you ought to run a government with some sort of rainy day fund. And for the United States federal government, our rainy day fund has been our ability to borrow. You may have noticed it was raining a lot, and we called on that, right? We took the debt, you know, we basically increased our debt by more than 50%. right, over the last couple of years in an effort to combat the financial crisis and the economic crisis. Lots of micro issues about that, but clearly the right thing to do from a macro point of view. But to be able to do that in the future, we got to get back down where it's easy to go borrow, where the world thinks we're the best place to invest. And then similarly, when you think about the fact that a variety of nations around the world, not all of which are our best buddies, own a lot of our debt, to what extent is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because A, we're going to be paying interest to them in the future, in return obviously for their financing ourselves now. And then B, there's this question about to what extent does that have spillovers into other choices that our government makes? And to what point does it become a concern that a certain country has particular geostrategic interests that is also buying a lot of our debt? I think to the current administration's great credit, they had no hesitation or not too much hesitation about meeting with the Dalai Lama and whatnot. But there is this concern that as you become more and more reliant on outside forces to finance the debt, that may have some effect on how we conduct other types of our policies, and that's not going to be in our long-term interest.
Yeah, let's make a couple of quick points. I agree with most of what was said, not all. The first piece I want to pick up on, though, is the allusion to the bond market. I think if we learned anything over the last couple of years, that we maybe shouldn't be putting a whole lot of stock in what the bond market thinks about various issues. But you're right. I think if the bond market reacts to raising interest rates on your debt, that is a problem. But what we know about from the evidence now, right? Interest rates are just about zero for short-term interest rates. Interest rates for even 10-year bonds are about 3.5%. So we're not talking about major problems right now in the bond market. Yes, that could change very quickly, but at least right now, evidence shows that the bond market is not terribly worried. We might say other things at the venues, but when you look at the hard price data, there's not a major interest rate hike priced into interest rates, at least right now. The second piece on the international front, maybe you mentioned China in particular, and I think it's important to note that a lot of the reason why China owns U.S. debt is not necessarily just because we have a large budget deficit, but because we have a large trade deficit. And then there's the fact that the Chinese currency is between 20 and 40% undervalued, meaning that we're running huge trade debt with China, and those dollars, they're taking a lot more dollars. Those dollars have to go somewhere, and right now they're being invested in treasury bills. So I think a lot of the problem with China and other foreign debtors is a trade problem first and foremost, and a budget problem only secondarily.
Do you want to talk about solutions?
Yeah, actually, I did. I also wanted to mention that Bob and Donald are both part of a sort of a parallel group to the fiscal commission that President Obama has put together. This is one by the Bipartisan Policy Center, which was a creation of several Senate leaders, Republican and Democrat, who wanted to create an entity that could hopefully cross the aisle and get some pragmatic solutions. But whether it's whether what you guys are doing, or whether what President Obama's commission comes with, what kind of solutions we have to look at in the long term. The first thing I'm thinking is the health care, as you mentioned, took more than $500 billion in 10 years out of Medicare. It would be hard to go back to that one. I would think people would be very reluctant. President Obama has said, although he hasn't said put this rule on the commission, he doesn't want to increase taxes on the middle class, those individuals under $200,000, families with less than $250,000 a year. Seems like revenues may need to go up while spending has to come down a little bit somehow. What types of solutions do you guys see?
Magic wand. You look at the numbers and you think about what you would have to do, and you sort of say you can't get there from here. So you have to throw away the rule book. And by the way, you mentioned the commission that Don and I are on. Anything I say about solutions is my own opinion and not anything that is being under discussion. I think that we're going to have to look at everything. In other words, all bets are off. I mean, I think anybody that looks at this has to say that revenues need to be on the table and all spending needs to be on the table. There are no sacred cows here because we have a situation that's just thoroughly unsustainable. I think that anything you do should be phased in. I think one of the things that I worry a little bit about is that the current budget deficit is so large, and as John illustrated, I think a lot of it is a result of a slow economy right now, and as the economy picks up steam, a lot of that will go away. The budget deficit will come down to a much lower level, but still a very high level relative to history. But people will think, well, the problem's gone away. So I think you can do things now that will phase in over time, much like the healthcare bill that's phased in savings over time. I might think those are phasing in a little bit too long, but I think you can take advantage of those sort of things. So what do you need to do? I think we need to continue to look at healthcare savings. There's no other way you can really do it. From the, Social Security reform looks like an easy one. It's been so controversial in the past, but you can get some savings from Social Security, but not alone. And that can make some contribution, and it's going to have to. There's no way that we can leave that alone. I think we need to look at the defense budget and what sort of a commitment you make there. I think you are going to have to look back at the healthcare, and that's why we said before that it has taken a lot of things off the table that one might have used. And then I think we're definitely going to look at revenues, and that doesn't just mean looking at raising rates. I think we need to look at tax reform, find a more efficient way of raising a great deal of revenue. So one might think of some sort of a bad tax in this country that's been floated. One might also look at revising the exclusion of health insurance from income. Now that was something that the Congress and the administration took a pass on and came up with this Cadillac tax instead, which is designed to try to get the same sort of thing. But there's a lot more revenues that you can get at by getting at some of these so-called tax expenditures or tax entitlements that are major preferences. But none of these things are politically easy. There's no such thing as a politically easy way out of this mess. So we might as well just bite the bullet and jump off the cliff, if I can mix metaphors. That sounds really delightful, doesn't it?
I'm trying to think of a more fruitful, more favorable metaphor, but I can't. Right, so there are three things we need to do, right? In principle, if we have the magic wand, right? So we need to decrease the growth rate of spending, we need to increase the growth rate and level of revenues. And to the extent that we can do something that causes our economy to grow faster and therefore generate more tax revenues, that would be a great stellar thing. Promoting growth is hard, but there are ways to do it, right? Our tax code is incredibly inefficient. There are changes we should make to it that will simultaneously raise more revenue and make less of a burden on the economy. On the spending side, and then so kind of everything needs to be on the table, right? So when we think about the spending, right, there's still an enormous amount of spending in the healthcare space, and at some point when the political will is there, we're going to need to go revisit that. Although politically that may be hard to get much enthusiasm for in the near term. There's Social Security. If I had a magic wand, you would, on the spending side of Social Security, you would, look at things like raising the normal retirement age and then moving to a more progressive benefit structure that basically reduces the growth rate of benefits for higher income folks somewhat, so that you get some savings on that front. Right, benefits would still rise in real terms, but at a slower rate than is currently projected. I think at some point here, Washington's going to have to get its act together and look at the defense budget seriously. We spend an awful lot of money, even if you strip out the wars. We spend an enormous amount of money on national defense. And there's a very good question about whether all of that is spent appropriately or whether we could get significant savings there. And then, at smaller levels, look around the rest of the budget. On the revenue side, I think for me, step number one is to look at the tax code. Our tax code is in some sense Swiss cheese. Right, in 1986, we tried to move to a tax code that is whatever famous kind of cheese doesn't have holes in it. And since then, there have been various exclusions, deductions, and credits and whatnot, some of which have good, completely legitimate public policy reasons, but a lot of them look like sort of giveaways to special interest groups where sometimes, frankly, I consider the vast American middle class as a special interest group for things like the mortgage interest deduction and the special tax treatment of health insurance. And that there's a lot of opportunities there, I think, from at least an economic point of view. This may be politically dead on arrival, but from an economic point of view, to look at the credits and exclusions and the things that complicate our tax code and give up tax revenue and walk those back in a way that gives us a more efficient tax system and higher revenue. And then, I'm a relatively green person, so the next thing on my list is something like a carbon tax as a way where you can kind of kill two birds with one stone, right? Address what, despite some, rhetoric recently in the headlines, nonetheless appears to be a significant environmental issue in a way that happens to raise revenue for the federal government. And then if those things aren't enough, right, as Bob said, at some point, maybe a value-added tax comes on the table. I'm not sure when or if the American people are going to be ready for that, but if you look around, if you go back to my OECD chart, right, 30 members of the OECD, 29 of them have a VAT and one doesn't. And that suggests to you that at least as a political imperative, if you're going to move to a situation in which you have a larger government that needs to be supported by a larger revenue source, at least history and international comparisons suggest that eventually that translates into having a VAT.
Yeah, I agree with what was said. I mean, I think first and foremost in my mind is jobs, right? Is getting the economy back on track in the short run. And that if we have 10% unemployment for another 2 or 3 years, our budget situation is going to be even worse than it looks like today. So that in my mind. And ironically, that means increasing deficits a little more today. It means doing things like extending unemployment insurance, giving more aid to state and local governments. It means perhaps direct job creation by letting mayors around the country hire people on the federal dime. So there's a lot of things that can be done in the short run, which might mean a slightly higher deficit today, but it's going to put our economy at much more solid footing going forward, which is going to help out the deficit situation in the long run. The second item is revenue, and a lot of the ideas that I mentioned here I agree with, especially the cap and trade piece. Either revenue from the cap and trade system on carbon or a carbon tax, that can mean significant revenue going into the economy. Now, you have to use some of that to offset the negative impacts of higher energy costs on low and moderate income families, but there's potentially a huge source of revenue there that could be tapped. I think the point about the VAT is probably right as well. The problem with the VAT is that it tends to fall more on low and moderate income families, so you have to make sure that you design the VAT correctly. You can't just put, in my opinion, a VAT on top of the current income tax code and leave it as is. You have to make adjustments to the tax code to make sure the entire tax code is fair, and that comes with its own challenges on that front. Over the long run, I think defense spending is something you have to look at. I think we have to look at healthcare spending. When you look at the long-term situation, it is overwhelmingly about healthcare. I think Bob's slide made that clear. It's not very much about Social Security. Social Security is a very minor problem in this overall long-term picture. It's about healthcare costs. And with the current healthcare package, is that going to do enough to constrain costs? You already said we don't know. We're hopeful. But if this doesn't do the trick, then we're going to have to look at other things that might do the trick going forward. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of bringing revenues in line with spending over the very long term.
Last question, then I want to open it up to the audience. Do you have a microphone for the audience? Okay. John, you mentioned the aid going to state and local governments. They're under a lot of pressure right now as well. And I think there's been some studies out recently looking at their pension plans as being woefully underfunded. We're focusing on the problem facing the federal government. What about state and local governments?
Well, they're in terrible shape. I mean, I'm sorry.
Let's shake it up a bit and go.
No, I disagree. Right? They're just terrible shape. At least in the short run. I mean, they've been hit incredibly hard by the loss of revenues from the economic downturn. They don't have the recourse of borrowing funds. So everyone here, no matter what state you're in, I know you've seen drastic cuts in services, sometimes across the board, sometimes more targeted. A couple states have tried to raise revenue. I believe Washington tried to raise some revenue with some more the tax front. But states have just been decimated. And this is probably going to last for years. The help that's come from the federal government has helped to fill some of that gap, but not nearly enough. And that's why I mentioned it, because that's one of the easiest, fastest, most effective ways to prevent job loss is to provide states with enough revenue to get by over the next couple of years. A lot of states do have long-term budget problems, various state to state, but in the short run, because it's so driven by the worst economic recession in 60 years, it's extraordinary times. So the more help we give to state and local governments, the better.
So I guess my happy spin on it is, right, so the states face a significant budget challenges. the short run, right, it's very much driven by the weak economy. In the longer run, it's similar to, but different from the federal government, but there's a significant, they have employee pensions, and they have healthcare spending on Medicaid. And the positive spin on it is, so they face significant challenges, particularly, kind of the states you can name, right, Illinois, New York, California, a few others, is that they may kind of play the laboratories of democracy role that we in Washington can learn for the federal government, is to observe kind of, some ways, our citizens kind of grappling with these problems and opens up, I think, the opportunity that we at the federal level may be able to learn something from how they decide how to grapple with this and what makes the policies they choose. But yeah.
They've got some big challenges from the healthcare bill too, because there are the expansion of Medicaid is a very big part of the new spending in the bill, and initially anyway, that will be covered by the federal government. But the idea is to, at some point, withdraw some of that support, and that was that whole deal about Nebraska, whether Nebraska would get a permanent 100% coverage or not. So I mean, it is, while the federal government is going to be there to provide some of the support, most of the support for the new mandates, nevertheless they are mandates, and they're probably going to result in higher healthcare costs for the states, and they're more constrained in how they can respond, because the state budgets of most states have requirements to run a balanced budget, and so the more spending mandates that Washington puts on them, the more difficult it becomes either to cut other things, and you're seeing some really very tough cuts in the state budgets now, and or to raise taxes. And the states have another problem, which is this, that to the extent that the federal government gets into the business of a consumption tax, it will be fighting with the state budgets, which many of which have sales taxes. They're one of their sources of revenue. So there are going to be some clashes with the state and federal budgets, and I think that really we have an increasing need to have the states reach some sort of understanding with the federal government about these things, looking at healthcare and revenues and thinking, how are we going to share the responsibilities and the revenues in the future. So I think that rather than just have this top-down sort of thing where the state and the federal government aren't really paying attention to one another, it would be good to have sort of a coordinated strategy and not just we'll just sort of see what happens and have a piecemeal strategy.
Oh, very good. Questions from the audience?
Good evening, folks. I'm a little naive, and this is the first time I've been there, but I wanted to ask you if in your projected deficits, will the numbers change when the Bush tax giveaway sunsets, and whether the war is sunset, and as the value-added tax that you were considering would crush more of the middle class, which is redistributing wealth upwards, would a luxury VAT be something that you would consider? Thank you.
On the tax cuts, the projections that I would use would assume that most of those will be extended, because that's what the president has proposed, and the overwhelming majority of both sides would propose. Now, there are some that would not extend all of them. Say the ones that's that income issue of people making $250,000 or above. So the original chart that I showed that showed the numbers never getting back together again assumed that the tax cuts would most of them would be perpetuated. It makes a big difference if you assume that they all went away. It makes an enormous difference. I mean, you could get back to a sustainable budget situation by the end of 10 years if those tax cuts all went away, as but there's no political will to do that. The administration made it clear that they were not going to have most of those tax cuts expire. So we're going to have to deal with that. On the other question of the war, there are various assumptions about that. The president's budget assumes that the war virtually ceases, but not completely. The Bush administration used to have this way of projecting war costs for the next year and then assuming zero thereafter, which made their budget projections somewhat suspect, let's say. The current administration assumes that the plug instead of zero is 50 billion, and we're spending around, I don't know, 150 billion or so now. So I'd say that too is a rather ambitious assumption, but a more realistic one than we had in the last administration. But it doesn't make the difference between a sustainable budget and not a sustainable budget. The revenue piece is much, much bigger. So what you assume about revenues is hugely more determinative. And a luxury VAT, I don't know, I think as John said, I think the way you would phase in some sort of a VAT would be really, really challenging. And I'm not sure what the terms of a luxury VAT would be. I'm not sure that probably others would have a better idea of how that would work revenue-wise.
So I'd say, drawing on kind of international historical experience, my guess is that as nations move towards VATs, they tend to accept the idea that it's going to be a less progressive tax system. In essence, that's kind of a trade-off that happens as you want to have a larger government and finance it with more revenues, is that just to collect the amount of money you need without distorting the economy too much. It seems that empirically countries adopt VATs that have fewer distortions. If you were going to do kind of a luxury VAT, the way I would think about it is not that you would distinguish among goods, right, and have a VAT on a Lexus and not have a VAT on a Toyota, but that you would try to do it at an individual level, so that you would say, we're going to have a VAT for everybody, and then you'd have some way of rebating to people who, are of moderate income, low income, whoever you want to target, some corresponding amount of money that more or less made them a whole for the amount of VAT that you wanted to cover them for. But that the way to do that is kind of from the person side and not from the product side.
Well, let me just add one caveat to that, I think, is that you can implement a VAT and exclude things like food or healthcare services, and the VAT would most likely exclude the imputed value of home ownership. And so there are ways to make a VAT a little more progressive than just simply flat tax. I think it's very hard to make it purely a luxury good VAT, but you can certainly move in that direction. And if you combine with other changes in the tax code that target very wealthy individuals, you can make something that is a tax system that is as progressive or more progressive than the current tax code. There's lots of examples of the tax code just being incredibly preferential to high-income taxpayers. There's something called the carried interest loophole that allows hedge fund managers to pay taxes at a 15% tax rate, despite making millions of dollars. So there's plenty of loopholes where you can raise significant revenue, make the tax code more progressive than it currently is, and work towards closing some of these long-term gaps that we've talked about. That's just one example. If you read Obama's budget, the list of tax proposals is huge, and a lot of these sound just obvious. A lot of the things about closing offshore tax shelters. It seems like both good tax policy targets very high-income individuals who've done incredibly well over the last 15, 20 years. You've seen their income skyrocket in ways that seems like it's more simple, it's more fair, it raises revenue, it solves some of these other problems. So that is one way to go, but we should not think of the VAT as a substitute for reforming the current tax code as it is. There are plenty of changes you need to make to the current tax code in addition to anything you want to do on the VAT front. So I think it's not an either-or situation, it's do both.
We have a question. We have a question over here.
Actually, if I could, if you want a couple CBO numbers, I brought my handy CBO tables with me. But they estimate under the president's budget, which is just allowing the tax cuts on wealthy to expire, but keeping them for everyone else. A total of $9.8 trillion in cumulative deficits over 10 years. Under the CBO baseline, which assumes current policy, so it assumes all the tax cuts would expire then, and then also the AMT would have more people, and they also assume more spending for the war than under the the Obama budget, but that's $6 trillion over 10 years. So you got that 3.8 trillion there, and I think about maybe 2.5 trillion of that is probably the tax bill.
Yeah, I just want to say, just to be clear, when I said if you let all that happen, if you let those expire, you get back to a sustainable thing within 10 years. I'm just talking about the annual deficit would get down to about 2.5% of GDP, which is the goal of a so-called sustainable. But you'd still have the long-term, I mean, repealing the Bush tax cuts would not solve, would get us off to a better start in terms of the short-term deficits, but we would still have this unsustainable. I don't want to leave the impression that the Bush tax cuts caused the problem. They may have exacerbated it, but we would have had the other problems.
Over here.
Thank you. We've been talking a lot of things. I'm sorry, Commissioner Eve Perkins from the Oakland Housing Authority Resident Commissioner. And we've been talking about a lot of what I would like to say from a college standpoint, macroeconomics, but being a housing redevelopment official, some of the things that I am concerned about, particularly in the state of California, we have the 8th largest economy in the world, are how NAFTA is affecting jobs. If I remember correctly, the gross domestic product also looks at finished goods and products. We don't make anything anymore, and we've become a service industry. More so, I would like to say, because I don't really see manufacturing plants and people working right now. And so, looking from a housing development official, I guess my questions to you is how can we look at either repealing or renegotiating NAFTA so that we can try and make sure that we're bringing jobs, and how can we be looking at green technologies as a new market so that we could start educating our youth and the people who we represent, which are residents who need jobs right now. Thank you.
I'm going to defer to the economists.
Well, if you're referring to the liberal economists who might not like NAFTA. No, I mean, I think, let me put this into a broader context. It's not just NAFTA. It's NAFTA, and then trade deficit with China, and a number of different issues. There's, free trade agreements with lots of other countries that have an impact. Countries with whom we trade and have large trade deficits is a potential drain on our economy, and therefore a drain on jobs. My organization, I'll give a plug to some of my colleagues there, at Economic Policy Institute have done some estimates about the potential job loss associated with large trade deficits. With China, we put out a report recently, it estimated about 2.4 million jobs have been lost as a result of our large trade deficits with China. This is not necessarily purely job loss, but jobs that would have been created here if it were not for greater imports than exports to China. So I think there is room to look at, negotiating new or different free trade agreements with North American countries or countries, other places in the world. China is the big problem, is what I mentioned earlier, the currency issue. The Chinese currency is not a free-floating currency. It is being manipulated by the Chinese government in order to keep the value artificially low. If that were not the case, we'd have a smaller trade deficit and probably more jobs here. So I am not an anti-trade zealot. I think trade is good in a lot of ways, but I do think we need to make sure that trade is on equal footing. Labor standards, intellectual property standards are all important parts of the equation. And so the status quo, I don't think, is a very good status quo. The flip side of your question is about green jobs. And what can we manufacture here? And I think we're at the point now where there's a decision point. Right? We can go along the same path we've been going and maybe do something with climate change, maybe not. And wind up, whatever we do, you can wind up importing goods from Germany, windmills from Germany, solar panels from Spain, component parts from China, and be a net purchaser of a bunch of new green goods. Or green goods and starting to manufacture that ourselves. Now, a lot of economists oftentimes use the word industrial policy as a negative and say the federal government should not be in a position of picking and choosing winners amongst the economy. And I agree with that to a large extent, except in this case. Right? We know we have to move to a green economy. We know that as we manufacture goods, right, green energy is manufactured energy. It's windmills, it's fuel-efficient cars, it's it's fuel-efficient trains, it's bus services. And we do manufacture a lot of that here. The question is bringing it up to scale here rather than trying to import it. And so that's trade policy, that's incentives for domestic production, that's cap and trade or carbon tax, and it's how all these things fit together. So I think I just brought your micro question to a macro perspective. But it's one of these things where there's not a single magic bullet. It's having a unified, coordinated federal policy to address all these issues. And doing one on its own just isn't research.
Thank you.
Ed Talbot, Urbana, Colorado. Two questions. One, it seems like as a country we tend to respond to crises. Joseph Plummer's going to hear a lot of this data, but he's not going to care about it, or if he does, he's going to say, that guy should take care of the problem, don't hurt me. So in your mind, is there kind of a precipitating event that could potentially be out there, like a Pearl Harbor on this issue, where all of a sudden people say, yes, we're all going to suffer, we're all going to have to do something to take care of it because it's so enormous? Second question, I hear these basic issues of fraud in our existing, say, medical system, Medicare, Medicaid, and I heard this number of $60 billion a year. And what hit me on that is when I see the ads on TV where they're saying if you're over 60, you can get this little electric cart. The government will buy it for you. You can run all over the place with an electric cart. And you see all these seniors running around on little electric carts in the ad. So how much, is there really a significant issue with fraud in terms of our medical system that really could be addressed that might have a significant effect here? So that's my two questions.
Two questions. Gee, I reserve the right to get my little scooter when I'm there. I wouldn't want to say anything that would jeopardize my, the older I get, the more I worry about those things. There have been a couple of instances in recent years that might have been the sort of crisis that some of us are looking for. Not that we're looking for a crisis, but you're right that there's some sort of a precipitating event can concentrate people's minds on hard choices. One of them was 9/11. I was somewhat hopeful that that would be such a shock, such a wake-up call, and the country was together, that you might think, well, we've got serious things that we need to do, and it sort of put partisan politics aside, including politics of some of the partisan issues over the federal budget, and take a more realistic look at things. And it didn't happen. So that was event number one. Event number two, I mean, the idea, when I say it didn't happen, you actually had I guess he was the majority leader of the House at the time, Tom DeLay, saying that the way to fund a war is to cut taxes. It's just, dogma covers all. I mean, I don't even know what to say. But that's actually what we tried to do. So that was one opportunity lost, I think. Then we had a big crisis at the end of last year, 2008. And we haven't, it hasn't really, maybe that hasn't played out fully yet, but I really haven't seen in the political rhetoric on either side any sort of desire to put things together. I mean, that's what my hope was for the commission. I don't know that that's going to happen. It really doesn't look like it. I mean, you had this ridiculous situation in the Senate where they had a bipartisan commission with Gregg and Conrad, and they took a vote on it, and then people that had endorsed the idea voted against it because it might actually happen. So I don't, I'm just not sure that we're there yet. And so if you get a crisis like 9/11 and a crisis like what happened in the financial markets, and that hasn't done the trick, I'm really not sure what will, except maybe the Chinese refusing to buy our bonds or something like that. That might, and maybe that's a silver lining for the Chinese holding so much of our debt. If they do some saber rattling, people might get concerned about it. But I don't know. I think we should be prepared to act without a crisis.
So just, can I say just so on the waste, fraud, and abuse question, So there is waste, fraud, and abuse, and you can save money by attacking it, but there's nowhere near enough money in there to kind of, bend the lines that we saw earlier.
We're right about at the end of our hour and a half, and it's been wonderful. I wonder if we could get a quick response, or because I'd like to ask you. I think it was John who had a chart on domestic spending, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, domestic discretionary spending is where our accounts fall. And we know as an organization, because we've been told that there's about a 3-year freeze on domestic discretionary spending. And it just seems like for political gain or otherwise, we continue to go back to domestic discretionary spending as a way of reducing that will make us feel better or make us more economically and fiscally healthy. And yet, your chart, John, doesn't seem to imply that at all. In fact, we've cut domestic discretionary spending quite a bit. So I just wonder, very, very quick answer maybe from all of you, whether this is going to continue to come up, and whether there's always going to be some sort of political pressure or otherwise to go to that one, to go to that side of the ledger to try to find fiscal nirvana. Maybe John, start with you.
Yeah, like I said earlier, domestic discretionary spending is not quote unquote out of control. It's not the major contributor to the long-term fiscal situation we're in. I think Bob's chart showed that fairly clearly. That even if you cut domestic discretionary spending 100%, you still have long-term budget problems. So, you can cut it a little bit, but it's not going to really address the long-term questions. In my mind, looking at just domestic discretionary spending is more about good governance than it is about addressing long-term fiscal imbalances. You don't want to waste money, and you want to be very careful at addressing every part of the budget to eliminate waste, be it fraud in the Medicare system, or be it bridges to nowhere that come out of domestic discretionary. But we also have to realize that a lot of good programs are in the domestic discretionary budget as well, and that simply taking a hatchet to that side of the ledger is not going to solve the long-run situation. It's not going to solve the short-run situation, and that's not where the problem is in. I'm fairly, to me, it's fairly obvious that this is an area where if you have a freeze, I've been critical of the Obama administration about having a freeze here. This is not what the problem is. You're not saving that much money, so why demonize the side of the ledger? To me, this is not what the problem is, and so this shouldn't be necessarily where the solution is either.
So just taking the risk of being an economist playing political scientist. So my observation is, right, so the challenge of appropriated funding is you have to go to Congress every year and get your money. Right? So unlike Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which will just run and operate, and Congress has to affirmatively decide to go touch them. Right? For discretionary spending, Congress has to deal with it, otherwise it goes to zero. And so that means that in the political system, it tends to get a lot of attention. Right? And then you have kind of the domestic discretionary spending, and then you have, kind of the defense spending. And, the reality is that it is politically difficult to do things on the defense side and the veterans benefits side. And so just as kind of the political equilibrium is to then say, well, as this president has done, let's look at the domestic discretionary and see if we can walk it back there. And as John says, there isn't that much money there, right? You should go, find whatever waste and fraud and abuse there is and get rid of it. But, that is not where the bulk of the money is. But it is in some sense the most politically exposed in the way we decide how to spend money.
Yeah, I mean that's really the problem. I think one of the things that's important to get across is that the domestic discretionary part of the budget is the most vulnerable to automatic spending growth in the other programs, and it is an important part of the budget because that's really to the extent that the federal government makes investments in domestic in human infrastructure and physical infrastructure. That's the part of the budget that it does so. So if that part of the budget, and there is waste, obviously there are ridiculous programs that are, the rich to nowhere is the favorite, but, and those are the high-profile things that really are annoying to people, and I've had this experience happen on the fiscal wake-up tour all the time, where you'll talk about the long-term trends, and the first question will be about the, earmarks. because it's just annoying, unless I guess most of the earmark is coming to your community college or something like that. By the way, we've had some of these fiscal wake-up tour events at community colleges, and I sometimes wonder, how much of them are funded by earmarks. But anyway, because they're high profile, you get this funhouse mirror view of the federal budget, that's really where the problem is. And that's why it's important for people to understand the dynamics, because if we let this go on, then an important part of the budget is really going to be squeezed. And frankly, why do people go after it? People are more vulnerable. It's a part of the budget that doesn't have quite the powerful lobbies behind the entitlement programs or behind the defense budget. So it comes up every year, as Don says. It's easier to get at, but it's not where the money is. We're never going to fix the problem by concentrating on that part of the budget. And to the extent you try to do so, you're going to cut out some bad with some good. Some good with the bad, excuse me. Let's target the good and save the bad.
I think they're absolutely right. The fact that you're looking at it every year as part of the appropriations process, and you have reporters and folks focusing all this and on this stuff, and especially the earmarks, which is really in the sideshow. I think the DC is just a small part of the even the discretionary budget. But I think the domestic discretionary is going to get caught in the squeezes. There's a real desire out there for moderate and conservative Democrats to show that they're serious about addressing the deficit. And there's going to be a lot of pressure for them to want to cap it somehow or restrict it. So I think it's not where the problem lies, but it's going to get caught up in the gears there.
It's not where the solution lies either. But it is where the action will be.
Well, on that note, I think it's a lesson to us as we go to the Hill on Tuesday. Last question, because again, our accounts, our programs are in the domestic discretionary side, and they are vulnerable. And it is up to us as an organization and as individuals who believe in these programs, who try to make these programs work, who need responsible funding for these programs to make them work, to at least speak out and speak on behalf of the necessity of providing funds to maintain them, to serve the people that we need to serve back home, families in need. I know some of you have had and do want to ask additional questions. This is a generous group that will, I think, stay for a few minutes and take some of your questions. I'm sorry we ran out of time because, as I said at the outset, this is becoming one of the more popular portions of our program, and I wish we did have more time, but you were invited.
We have the Concord vote, and if people want to submit some written questions, we'll try to get back to the website.
Written questions as well. To our friends watching on webcast, thank you for joining us. To all of you, we have a reception, a welcoming reception right after this presentation. And with that, would you give a warm thank you? Thank you all for coming.